Hello, great government aviators. I hope you're having an awesome week. I am out of town, as you know, and I wanted to make sure we got through a little bit of material this week about the Constitution and some new stuff we haven't talked about. So I made a little video of what we would have done with our notes. And if you want to get your how to amend the Constitution fill-in notes, you can follow right along with this. We'll chop it up so that you're not getting too overwhelmed at one time. And we'll just talk through it together. So if you have any questions about this at the end or in the middle or whenever, you can always email me. I will try to get back to you within 24 hours, okay? So let's get started on how to amend the Constitution. First, we got to know what the Constitution is built like. There's three parts to the Constitution. You guys know the first part. It's called the preamble. It starts with 3 words. I'll give you 5 seconds to think of those 3 words. It's we the people. So we the people is the beginning of the Constitution, and that is called the preamble. The preamble is the very first part. It's the introduction. It's kind of a summary of why they're writing the Constitution. The second part is called the articles. That's like the meat. That's like the heart of the Constitution. That talks about what government does, what it should and shouldn't do, why it exists, etc. So that's called the articles. And the final part, which is what we're starting to talk about in this unit, is called the amendments. So that's where your Bill of Rights and your right to free speech and your right to bear arms and all that stuff is in the amendments in the Constitution. Preamble, articles, amendments. Take a second to fill that into your fill-in notes. And again, if you have any questions about this, if you miss something, you can always pause the recording. You can stop. You can go back. So this is on you. You can slow it down. It's all just a YouTube video, so just like you would a normal video. And hopefully we're all caught up by the end of this thing. So I'll give you a second to write that in. Okay, so the structure of the Constitution. I'm not going to read off all this stuff to you because you guys are smart. You can all read. But what I am going to tell you are a couple notes that I'd like for you to put into this, into your chart here. There's 7 articles to the Constitution, and they're broken up as follows. So the first 3 articles really talk about the different branches of government, and the last 4 just talk about how things and people and governments are supposed to relate with the Constitution. So Article 4 talks about the state's relationship with each other. Article 5 is what we're going to talk about today, which is amending the Constitution. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, which you guys know what that means. And Article 7 is ratification. So basically, how was the Constitution supposed to get approved by the states after it had been approved by the 55 people in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention? So it's broken up into 7 parts. Fill this into your fill-in notes. You will at some point need to know at least where some of these things fall. What I will tell you is, that's not really in writing on the slide, is the reason they started with the legislative branch. The reason the Founding Fathers started with the legislative branch is because they knew that that branch represented the people. So the legislative branch is Congress, which is the House and the Senate, House of Representatives and the Senate. It represents people from all over the country, from rural areas, from cities, from big states, from small states. It is the most representative branch of the people. So we, the people, are writing this Constitution. The legislative branch, in their mind, was the most important because it represents the people, and that's why it's first. Again, this is a good place to pause and see if you can fill in the 7 articles part of your sheet. Okay, if you haven't already seen this picture, this is a current event that happened maybe a couple weeks ago. A photographer, a wildlife photographer, went to Indonesia to photograph a group of monkeys that live there in the jungles. He set up his camera on a tripod and left it for a while, and at some point a monkey came up to his camera and took a selfie. So the fight after this picture came out, because this is the monkey clicking the picture button, was who owns the rights to those pictures. So we're talking about rights, and while this isn't in America and it's not about animals, the Bill of Rights isn't, an interesting thing that came up in that was who owns the rights to that property. And an animal rights group called PETA went to court internationally to try to fight on behalf of the monkey, saying because the monkey took the picture and clicked go or click or whatever, The monkey owns the rights to the picture. So that went to court for a while, ended up the photographer won, but this was a funny little video about this. So I want you to watch this video, and I've got a question in the notes there for you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what this lesson is really about, which is how to amend the Constitution. Amend is just another word for change. So whenever you see amending something, you change it. If you rip your shirt or you rip your jeans, you got to mend them. You have to mend your clothes, right? So amending is just another word for changing or replacing or fixing. So in the anti-federalist mind, they thought that the Constitution needed to be fixed or changed. So this is what they did. They put in these first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, which we talked about last week, and you'll talk about more this week, or you have already. Funny little cartoon here. You got Benjamin Franklin on the left. You got Thomas Jefferson in the middle. And they're talking about freedom of the bench press. Get it? Freedom of the bench press. Not a real amendment, but yeah, just laugh. You can laugh out loud if you want. That's fine. Okay, there's two ways to change the Constitution. There's two actual pathways to change the Constitution. If you've never seen Zoolander, you should see it. Great movie. The second one's not as good as the first one, but the first one's really good. The first way is called a formal amendment. You guys are going to be wearing some formal attire here, potentially, if you're going to homecoming this weekend. I encourage you guys to go, whether you're going with somebody or with friends or on your own or whatever. It's a good time, so if you guys are free to go, it's always fun. A formal amendment is, oh, by the way, the ticket sales are still going on. If this is Thursday, this should be the last day of ticket sales. So the first way to change the Constitution is in written word. And that's what an amendment is. It actually changes in writing something that was written in the Constitution. That's what an amendment is. That's what it does. You guys know what the first 10 amendments are. We kind of just talked about that. They're called the Bill of Rights, and they came out initially when the Constitution was first ratified or approved by the states. If you'll remember, the states wouldn't approve it, and the Anti-Federalists would not agree unless there was a Bill of Rights in it. So it's survived for such a long time because it has the ability to change. It has the ability to change. So it's survived for 200 years, our Constitution has, because it has the ability to change. It was actually one of the only, and at the time, the first written constitution of any government. Usually it was just a matter of whatever the person in charge wanted to do in other countries. American Constitution was the first written constitution. So it survived for so long, even though all that writing is about a time and place that barely even exists anymore, because it's been able to change. It has the ability to change. Survive because it has the ability to change. Amendments 11 through 27, Amendments 11 through 27 have been added throughout the course of current events and historical events, and they're based on what's happening at the time. So we'll talk about the rest of the amendments next week, but just know that there have been other amendments that have been added after the first 10 because of things that have been happening over time. So what's some famous ones? The right of women to vote, prohibition of alcohol. Those are two famous ones. 18-year-olds having the right to vote. Those are three famous amendments that have changed because of current events, and we'll talk about those more. Okay, so this part I'm not going to talk through as much. I'm just going to kind of let you look at the picture and digest it a little. So on your fill-in notes, there are 4 blocks, and there's 4 ways to change the Constitution. Okay, there's 4 ways to change the Constitution. There are 2 steps in each of those processes, and I'm going to see if I can use this little tool to draw something. Step 1 in the first way is this part. Okay, step 1 is that part where it's proposed by Congress in a vote of 2/3 of the House, and it's ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So this arrow right here is indicating step 1. That is the most common way that the Constitution has been changed. So step 1 is the most common way the Constitution has been changed. Go ahead and pause the video, fill that into your chart. Okay, step 2, which is the second most common way, which is like almost never, are when Congress proposes it and the state conventions, which is just a group of people gathering in each state, approve it. So Congress proposes it and the states approve it. So again, it's a matter of federal government and state government. And I'll give you a little, here's a little quiz on the 6 principles of government. When we're talking about federal government and state government, what principle of government are we talking about? So there's 2 levels here that are sharing power, federal and state. What principle of government is that? That should be on the underneath your chart, so if you want to pause for a sec, you can write in that answer right now. Okay, 2 other ways that are not as common are when a national convention called by Congress, 2/3 of states requested by 2/3 of state legislators. So the states are requesting the federal government to meet. They propose an amendment, and then it's ratified by legislatures. And the 4th way is Congress proposing the amendment and states approving it. Again, all you need to take away from this slide is A, just fill in the chart with the description of it that's written down, and B, just know that it is a sharing of power between national and state. So the Founding Fathers said, we need a way for both of these things to be checked, for the national government and the state government to be checked when we amend the Constitution. It's got to be a hard process, or else it would change all the time, and then it would change back, and it would keep going on. And the way they decided to do this was with this 2-step process. So just know that the most common way that it's changed has been the top way. Okay, the most common way has been this top way, where it's proposed by 2/3 and approved by state legislatures. A state legislature, this word right here, state legislature, is the same thing as Congress, but at the state level. So every state has a legislative branch, and that legislative branch is like a Congress for the state. So Ohio has a legislative branch that works in Columbus, and Kentucky's got one, and New York's got one, and California's got one. They all have a legislative branch. They do the law making or the law writing for the state. So take a second and fill in your chart. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully that's not you guys right now. Hopefully you're still awake. The second way to change is actually before we talk about the informal amendments. This little chart just shows a list of all the amendments that have been proposed. Whoops. And what you may not be able to see because my toolbar is in the way is at the very bottom, the 27th Amendment. It was approved in 1992. It tells Congress people that they can't get a pay raise until they get voted into office again. So like you can't be in Congress and just say I want a pay raise and then make that a law. You have to get that pay raise, you got to be elected again. And that was actually proposed 202 years ago, before 1992. So 1790 is when that was first proposed. It took 202 years to get approved. So you can see how long it takes for some of these amendments to get ratified. Some are really, really quick, like 26, the voting age of 18, 3 months. It was during the Vietnam War, and people were all like, hey, if 18-year-olds can get drafted, they should be able to vote, and they couldn't until then. And some take a really long time, like 200 years. So that's just some background on that. Again, we'll talk about the 11th or 27 amendments a lot more next week. Okay, the second way to change the Constitution is called an informal method. So as you can imagine, if a formal method is a change in the actual writing, an informal method is really just changes of day-to-day practices of the government. So a little Fresh Prince of Bel-Air picture. He's informally dressed. That's why I put that in there. But this is how the Constitution really changes, is informal changes. And they're created through the day-to-day experiences of the government. So they're not really written out. They're just things that the government does where there were gaps in the wording of the Constitution that they've done over 200 years. You know, like there was no internet 200 years ago. So what does the government do to deal with the internet? You know, there was no, half the countries on the globe didn't even exist 200 years ago. So how does the government get along with those countries? So that stuff wasn't in the Constitution. So it's just been changed through informal amendments, not writing, but day-to-day experiences of the government. Okay, there's a few different ways. There are actually 5 different ways that the Constitution changes informally. Yes, we will watch the Schoolhouse Rock video. Not today, but we will watch it at some point. Congress has added some details to the vague structure. So think of the Constitution like the bones of the government, and the basic legislation and the informal changes are like the meat, like the muscle and tissue and all that stuff that's added to the bones to make it a real thing, like a living thing. So basic legislation. So this is just day-to-day actions of the Congress that have spelled out how things are done in the Constitution, like what should be done. They really have taken all different kinds of turns in that, but they don't have a specific angle. They're just set up so they can show people how things should be done. Again, you can slow down on this or stop or pause or whatever as you need to. I just want to make sure you feel like you understand the material a little bit. The second way that it formally changes, and this is probably the most public of the informal changes, the most public of the informal changes is by executive action, and that's the president using their powers. So when the president uses the powers that they have in the Constitution in a way that they're not written, you know, about in the Constitution, that's really executive action that changes how the Constitution is interpreted. Vietnam War was a great example. That war was never declared. Nobody ever declared that war. 58,000 Americans died. It took about 20 years. It ended in essentially a stalemate kind of withdrawal, and a lot of Americans fought hard, but there was no declaration of war. It was all presidents just using the power of being commander-in-chief to send the military wherever they want. You know, good or bad, throughout the course of history, that power has been used a lot more since Vietnam. So that is the way. That's one example of a way a president has used their powers to change how the Constitution is read. Another one is through alliances, through executive agreements, which is just, it's not a real treaty. It's just the president of one country, as you see on the picture on the bottom right, Barack Obama and the premier of China at the time shaking hands. It's just the president of one country and the president of another country saying, yes, we should have an agreement together. And that's all. Nobody else is approving it, nobody else is acting on it, but the world recognizes that as being official. So that's how executive action has changed how the Constitution is read. Pause for a sec, take a second to fill in your notes. Once you fill in the little blurb about executive action and how the president has used powers, the one thing that we want to take away from Vietnam about how it's changed the way the Constitution is read is now that Congress has always had the power to declare war. Because that war was so long and so costly in terms of American lives and was never declared, Congress created a War Powers Act after that, which set a time limit on how long a president can use troops before, in an undeclared war, before Congress has to declare it. So initially when they wrote the Constitution, nobody ever thought of that. Nobody ever thought, wow, we should put a time limit on how long presidents can use troops, because it took so long to send your troops everywhere by sea and prepare them and everything. They thought it would just be done all the time. But in the 20th century, when it happened really quickly, Congress saw this problem, you know, decades later, and said, we got to change the way the president uses troops because they're using them with too much power. So the way the presidential action during the Vietnam War changed how the Constitution was read was that it forced Congress to more strictly apply its power to declare war. Okay, hope you got a little time to pause and fill that in. As I flew on Delta, actually, on my way to England, I thought of this very funny SNL video. So go ahead and take a look. Okay, almost done. You guys are doing awesome. Almost done. The third way, so we talked about the legislative branch changing the Constitution through day-to-day practices. We talked about the executive branch changing the Constitution through executive action. The third way is through court decisions. All right, so court decisions have happened over time, a lot of them, and there's a famous one that's shown on this picture here. And they have taken the shape of changing the Constitution, and it's really about the way the Supreme Court reads the Constitution. How they read it 200 years ago is way different than how they read it today. So they've changed how they read the Constitution, and as a token of that, everybody has changed how they read the Constitution based on what the court says. The pictures below are one huge example. In 1896, the picture on the left was the Plessy versus Ferguson case, where an African-American man wanted to sit in an all-Caucasian compartment of a train, and he was denied access. That went to court, and the doctrine of separate but equal was upheld by the court. In 1896, the Supreme Court said, yep, separate but equal, totally cool, we don't care. In 1954, 60 years later, if you look at the picture on the right, there was a little girl who wanted to go to school in Kansas, and she was African American. The school was all white, but her family protested and said, that's not fair. This is the closest public school to our house, so we should have the right to go there just like everybody else. She was denied that right, and the case went to the Supreme Court, and in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court overturned the decision they made 60 years before in the picture on the left in Plessy versus Ferguson. So in Brown versus Board of Education, they said that separate but equal was not equal and was not fair. And so finally, after 60 years, the Supreme Court changed how it read the Constitution, but thankfully so, because of these informal changes, America changed how it read the Constitution too. So that's just one example of an informal change. It's not an actual change to the wording, an informal change of how the Constitution has been read by the court over time differently. So Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. Pause for a second and fill in your notes. All right. The fourth way the Constitution changes informally is through political party practices. One of the things that George Washington said when he left office was to avoid entangling alliances and to avoid political factions, which is what a political party is. It's a political factions. They didn't have real official political parties back then, and he thought that would rip America apart. However, over the course of time, of course, we formed political parties, right? And some people would say that's been better than not having one party. We'll talk about that next week. But these party practices have changed how the Constitution is read. We have a whole primary system, an election season for president, campaigns, stuff that was never in or talked about the Constitution. We have a national convention that picks a political candidate. That was never talked about in the Constitution. That's been one way that the Constitution has changed over time informally. It's not in the Constitution, too. The words political party never show up in the Constitution, but it has changed over time informally because of that, because of political parties just forming from what people want. Don't blame me, I voted for Pizza Party. I will always eat pizza. It's like my favorite food, so that's why I put that picture on there. Take a second, fill in your notes. Okay, and the fifth and final way it changes is through custom, and that's just how things are done, right? The two examples that you'll see are on the left, when John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson. If anybody knows what Lyndon B. Johnson's middle name is, you get way bonus heart points for that, and you can fill it on your notes. I'll give you a few seconds to think of it, but if you know it, go ahead and write it in now. His middle name is Baines. Very common name, Baines. not. That's a joke. It's not common at all. Anyway, when he was sworn in as president, there was no process. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. His wife is on the right in that picture. This is the picture on the bottom left. She's still kind of in shock and in tears as they are in an airplane terminal flying back to Washington to swear him in as president. There was no process for that before because nobody had ever been assassinated like that before and needed that quickly to have a successor named. Presidents had been assassinated, and historically, the vice president just took over. So that's what's happening in this picture. They're saying, well, we don't have a rule for this, but because it's always happened, this is what's happening now. So custom. They made an amendment after that. After Lyndon Johnson, they said, we got to put something in writing because this is too crazy. On the right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. George Washington only served 2 terms as president, the first president. At the end of the second term, he left office because he said if somebody serves more than 2 terms, they're going to turn into a king. And that's not what we want. And until then, every president after George Washington had voluntarily left after 2 terms because they all said, hey, George Washington left, I'm going to leave too. Until Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the 1930s and 1940s, he was elected to 4 terms. He said, well, America needs me, they want me, I'm going to run. He was elected to 4 terms, and when he was elected the 4th time, he ended up dying really quickly into the 4th term. And America, Congress, the people said, we need something that prevents people from running forever, because he would have probably won more terms, because everybody knew who he was. So the 22nd Amendment was passed after FDR died, and it limited the president to 2 terms. If you know FDR's middle name, you can write that down too. Wow, huge hard points if you know this one. 5 seconds. It's Delano, D-E-L-A-N-O. Also a very common name. Okay, last funny clip of the slideshow. I just think this was friggin' hilarious when I saw it on SNL, and I love this clip, so enjoy. Okay, so the takeaway from all this is that the Constitution has survived for 200 years because of its ability to change. If it didn't have the process of amendments, if we didn't have that process in writing, nothing would have survived for as long as it did. So the ability to change the Constitution is the prime reason that it has survived. And that's why it continues to survive today. We fight about it. Americans don't agree on a lot of things, and we very violently disagree sometimes. But the reason we stick to this Constitution, whether you're Republican or Democrat or liberal, conservative, or wherever you fall on that spectrum, is because it's changed over time. So, that's the end of the slideshow. Thank you so much for paying attention. I appreciate you. I miss you guys. Enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy the weekend. So today's Thursday, so the rest of the bell, you should have about 15 minutes left. You can go ahead and try to catch up on any of the other stuff that you need to do, whether it's the writing assignment or the online game from yesterday or the questions or whatever. Okay, so take your time, finish up what you got to do. You got about 15 minutes, hopefully, and I can't wait to see you guys on Monday.